Sarah Martinez never imagined that clocking out from her final nursing shift at Walter Reed Medical Center would mark the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter of her life. For 12 years, she had walked the sterile corridors, tended to wounded warriors, and wiped away tears from soldiers who called out for their mothers in the darkness. She thought she was saying goodbye to that world forever when she turned in her badge that Thursday evening in March. What she didn't know was that 3,000 miles away, a classified mission was about to go terribly wrong. What she couldn't have predicted was that her phone would ring at 2:47 a.m. with a voice she didn't recognize, speaking words that would change everything. "Ma'am, we need you. The team is down, and you're the only one who can save them." Some stories begin with a single moment that splits life into before and after. This is one of those stories. It's about a nurse who thought her service was over, only to discover that her most important mission hadn't even begun yet. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Martinez walked down the hospital corridor one last time. Her sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum floor, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her life over the past 12 years. The weight of her stethoscope around her neck felt heavier than usual, as if it knew this would be their final journey together. Sarah had started working at Walter Reed Medical Center fresh out of nursing school, young and eager to make a difference. She was 24 then, with dreams of healing the world one patient at a time. Now, at 36, those dreams had been tempered by reality, shaped by countless nights spent holding the hands of dying soldiers and celebrating the small victories of those who learned to walk again. The cardiac surgery unit where she worked had seen her through marriages, divorces, births, deaths, and everything in between. She knew every corner of this place, every creaky door, every temperamental vending machine. The night shift had been her domain for 8 years, ever since her divorce when she needed the extra pay and the solitude that came with working while the rest of the world slept. Tonight was different. Tonight was her last shift, and everyone knew it. The farewell cake in the break room had been devoured hours ago, leaving only crumbs and sticky frosting on paper plates. Her colleagues had hugged her, wished her well, and made her promise to stay in touch. But now, in the quiet hours before dawn, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts and the steady beeping of monitors that would soon belong to someone else's responsibility. She stopped outside room 314, where Sergeant First Class David Kim lay recovering from his third heart surgery. He was 28 years old, the same age Sarah had been when she first met him during his initial admission 3 years ago. An IED explosion in Afghanistan had damaged his heart, and subsequent complications had brought him back to Walter Reed again and again. "Hey, Doc Martinez," David called softly as she peeked into his room. He always called her Doc, even though she corrected him countless times. "Heard tonight's your last rodeo." Sarah stepped into the room, checking his monitors out of habit. "That's right, David. Time for this old nurse to try something new." "Oh," David laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his surgical site. "You're not old. You're just getting started. What are you going to do now?" It was a question Sarah had been asking herself for months. After 12 years of the intense, high-stakes world of military medicine, what came next? She had saved enough money to take some time off, maybe travel, perhaps go back to school. The possibilities felt endless and terrifying at the same time. "I don't know yet," she admitted, adjusting his pillow. "Maybe I'll write that book I always talked about. Maybe I'll learn to paint. Maybe I'll just sleep for a month." "You'll figure out," David said with the confidence of someone who had faced death multiple times and come back stronger. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who's not done changing the world yet." Sarah smiled, feeling tears prick at the corner of her eyes. This was why she would miss this job. Not just the medical challenges or the professional satisfaction, but the people, the warriors who taught her about courage every single day, who showed her that healing was about more than just mending bodies. She made her rounds to the other patients, each goodbye feeling more final than the last. There was Marine Lance Corporal Jessica Torres, who was learning to use prosthetic legs after losing both limbs to an explosion. She was 22, younger than some of Sarah's nieces, but She faced each day with a determination that humbled everyone around her. "You sure you can't stick around just a little longer?" Jessica asked when Sarah stopped by her room. "I'm going to miss having someone who actually understands what I'm going through." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, something she rarely allowed herself to do during regular shifts. Tonight was different. Tonight she could take the time to really talk. "You know what I've learned in all my years here?" Sarah said. "I've learned that healing isn't something one person does for another. It's something we do together. You're going to be fine, Jessica. More than fine. You're going to be extraordinary." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen extraordinary before, and it looks exactly like you." They talked for another 20 minutes about Jessica's plans for the future. She wanted to become a physical therapist to help other amputees learn to walk again. She had dreams of competing in the Paralympics, maybe even starting her own foundation. Her eyes lit up when she talked about these plans, and Sarah could see the warrior's spirit that no explosion could destroy. The next room held Army Captain Michael Roberts, a 34-year-old father of 3 who had suffered a massive heart attack during a training exercise. He wasn't a combat injury, but the stress of multiple deployments had taken its toll on his cardiovascular system. Sarah had been with him through the darkest moments, when he questioned whether he would live to see his children graduate from high school. "My kids made you something," he said, pointing to a colorful drawing taped to his bedside table. It showed stick figures and scrubs with hearts floating around them, and the words, "Thank you, Nurse Sarah," written in crayon. Sarah picked up the drawing, studying the careful detail his 8-year-old daughter had put into drawing her stethoscope. "This is going on my refrigerator," she said. "They want to be doctors when they grow up," Michael said. "All 3 of them. They say they want to help people like you do." "They'll be amazing doctors," Sarah replied. "They've got the most important qualification already." "What's that?" "They know what it means to have a hero for a father." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "I don't feel like a hero. I feel like I'm broken." Sarah sat down beside him, her voice gentle but firm. "Michael, I've seen broken. Broken is someone who gives up. You're not broken. You're rebuilding. And sometimes what we rebuild is stronger than what we started with." As the night wore on, Sarah found herself moving slower than usual, savoring these final moments. She updated charts, administered medications, and responded to call lights, but her mind was elsewhere, remembering all the lives that had intersected with hers in this place. There had been so many patients over the years. Some had died despite everyone's best efforts. Others had recovered beyond all expectations. Some had become friends, staying in touch long after their discharge. Others had simply passed through her life for a brief moment, but each had left their mark. She thought about Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had coded 3 times during her first week at Walter Reed, but fought back each time because she had promised her 5-year-old son she would come home. Maria was now working as a paramedic in her hometown in Texas, saving other people's children. She remembered Colonel James Washington, a career officer who had suffered a stroke during his final deployment. He had been angry and bitter when he first arrived, raging against the end of his military career. Sarah had sat with him during his darkest moments, listening to his fears and helping him find a new purpose. He now ran a nonprofit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian life. There was Private First Class Anthony Chun, barely 19 when he arrived with shattered legs and a shattered spirit. Sarah had helped him through his recovery and watched him transform from a scared kid into a confident young man who went on to become a teacher. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads of courage, resilience, and the power of human connection. Sarah had been privileged to witness these transformations, to play a small part in helping these warriors reclaim their lives. At 5 in the morning, Dr. Patricia Williams stopped by the nurses' station. She was the head of cardiac surgery, a brilliant surgeon who had worked alongside Sarah for 8 years. They had saved countless lives together, shared the weight of impossible decisions, and celebrated victories that seemed miraculous. "You know you don't have to leave," Dr. Williams said. "We could arrange different shifts, different responsibilities. This place won't be the same without you." Sarah appreciated the offer, but she knew it was time. "I need to see what else is out there," she said. "I need to find out who I am when I'm not Nurse Martinez. You'll always be Nurse Martinez, Dr. Williams replied. It's not just what you do. It's who you are. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise through the large windows that overlooked the hospital grounds. The morning shift would be arriving soon, bringing fresh energy and new perspectives. Life at Walter Reed would continue without her, as it should. At 7 o'clock sharp, Sarah gathered her personal belongings from her locker. 12 years of memories fit into a single cardboard box. Pictures of patients who had become friends, thank you notes from families, small gifts that marked special moments. She had already taken home the larger items over the past few weeks, but these treasures had waited until the very end. Her replacement was a young nurse named Kevin Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname. He was fresh out of nursing school, eager and nervous in equal measure. Sarah had spent the past 2 weeks training him, sharing not just the technical aspects of the job, but the emotional intelligence that came only with experience. Remember, she told him as they stood outside the elevator, the monitors and machines can tell you a lot about a patient's condition, but they can't tell you everything. Sometimes the most important part of healing happens when you just listen. Kevin nodded seriously, clearly understanding the weight of responsibility he was inheriting. What if I make a mistake? You will make mistakes, Sarah said honestly. We all do. The important thing is to learn from them and never stop caring about the people in your care. The moment you start seeing patients as just cases or numbers is the moment you need to find a different job. She handed him a small notebook filled with her observations about each current patient. It wasn't part of the official handoff, but it contained the kind of personal details that made all the difference in patient care. David Kim's favorite music helped him sleep. Jessica Torres got scared during thunderstorms. Michael Roberts liked to talk about his kids when he was feeling anxious about his recovery. This is the real job, Sarah explained. The medical stuff is important, but this is what separates good nurses from great ones. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Sarah felt a mix of sadness and anticipation. The sadness was for all the goodbyes, for the end of a chapter that had defined her adult life. The anticipation was for the unknown, for the chance to discover what came next. She walked through the lobby for the last time, past the memorial wall that honored fallen soldiers, past the coffee shop where she had spent countless breaks, past the information desk where volunteers directed worried families to their loved ones. Each step took her further away from the world she had known and closer to whatever lay ahead. Outside, the March morning was crisp and clear. Cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom on the trees that lined the hospital grounds, a reminder that endings often coincided with new beginnings. Sarah stood for a moment, breathing in the fresh air and feeling the sun on her face. Her car was parked in the same spot where she had left it thousands of times before, but somehow it looked different today. It was no longer just transportation to and from work. It was a vehicle that could take her anywhere she wanted to go. As she drove away from Walter Reed Medical Center, Sarah felt the weight of the past 12 years settling on her shoulders like a comfortable blanket. She had given everything she had to that place, and those patients. She had laughed with them, cried with them, celebrated their victories, and mourned their losses. But now was time for something new. She didn't know what that would be yet, but for the first time in years, the uncertainty felt exciting rather than terrifying. She had skills, experience, and a deep understanding of human resilience that would serve her well wherever she went next. The radio played softly as she drove through the familiar streets of Washington, D.C., past monuments and government buildings that had provided the backdrop for this chapter of her life. The city was waking up, people heading to jobs and schools and appointments, all of them carrying their own stories of triumph and struggle. Sarah had been part of so many of those stories over the years. She had witnessed the worst moments of people's lives and helped them find the strength to keep going. She had seen the power of hope in the darkest circumstances and learned that healing was as much about the spirit as it was about the body. Whatever came next, she would carry these lessons with her. The patients at Walter Reed had taught her about courage, resilience, and the importance of human connection. They had shown her that strength could be found in the most unlikely places and that healing was always possible, even when it looked different than expected. As she turned into her apartment complex, Sarah felt a sense of completion. One chapter was ending, but the story was far from over. She had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, her phone would ring with an opportunity that would test everything she had learned about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of being called to heal. The sound of her alarm clock never came. For the first time in 12 years, Sarah Martinez woke up naturally, sunlight streaming through her bedroom curtains instead of the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor greeting her consciousness. She lay in bed for a few extra minutes, savoring the luxury of not having anywhere urgent to be. Her small apartment felt different in the morning light. Without the constant pressure of work schedules and life-or-death decisions, everything seemed quieter, more peaceful. She had lived here for 6 years, but she realized she had never really taken the time to appreciate the way the morning sun created patterns on her hardwood floors, or how the neighbor's cat liked to sit on the fire escape outside her window. Sarah made coffee in her kitchen, taking her time to actually taste it instead of gulping it down between patient rounds. She had nowhere to be, no one depending on her immediate attention. The freedom was exhilarating and slightly terrifying. For 12 years, her days had been structured around other people's needs. Now, she had to figure out what she needed. She spent the morning reading, something she had missed during her years of exhaustion and constant work. She had a stack of books that had been waiting patiently on her nightstand, novels and memoirs that promised escape and insight in equal measure. By afternoon, she had finished the first 100 pages of a book about a woman who quit her corporate job to travel the world. The parallels were not lost on her. Around 2 o'clock, Sarah decided to venture out into the world as a civilian. She drove to a small cafe she had always wanted to try, but never had time for during her working years. It was the kind of place that served artisanal coffee and homemade pastries, where people sat at small tables with laptops and journals, looking contemplative and creative. She ordered a lavender latte and a blueberry scone, indulgences that felt almost rebellious after years of grabbing whatever was available from vending machines during brief breaks. The barista was a young woman with colorful tattoos and a warm smile who took time to explain the different coffee options. Sarah realized she had forgotten what it was like to have conversations that weren't about medical conditions or treatment plans. Sitting by the window with her fancy coffee, Sarah watched people walk by on the sidewalk. She found herself making up stories about their lives, wondering about their jobs and dreams and challenges. A businessman hurried past, checking his phone anxiously. A young mother pushed a stroller while juggling coffee and a phone call. An elderly couple walked slowly, holding hands and pointing at something in a shop window. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. For 12 years, Sarah had been intimately involved in some of the most dramatic chapters of people's lives. She had seen them at their most vulnerable, helped them through their darkest moments, celebrated their victories. Now she was just an observer, watching life happen around her instead of being in the center of the storm. It was peaceful, but it was also strange. She felt like she was watching a movie instead of living her own life. The intensity of her work at Walter Reed had been exhausting, but it had also given her days a sense of purpose and urgency that she was only now realizing she would miss. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jessica Torres, the young Marine she had said goodbye to the night before. Day 2 without my favorite nurse. The message read, "Learning to walk is hard, but I'm pretending you're here cheering me on." Sarah smiled and typed back a response full of encouragement and pride. She realized that even though she had left the hospital, the relationships she had built there didn't end. The people she had cared for would always be part of her story, just as she would always be part of theirs. Evening came slowly, and Sarah found herself at loose ends. She cooked dinner for herself, a real meal with multiple courses instead of whatever she could grab between shifts. She opened a bottle of wine that had been gathering dust in her cupboard and toasted her newfound freedom. But As night fell, she felt restless. Her body was used to being active during the overnight hours, alert and responsive to the needs of patients who couldn't sleep. She tried watching television, but nothing held her interest. She tried reading, but her mind wandered. Finally, she decided to go for a walk around her neighborhood, something she had never done at night, because she was always at work. The streets were quieter than she expected. Most people settled in for the evening with their families or their routines. She walked past houses with lit windows, catching glimpses of other people's lives. A family eating dinner together, someone washing dishes at a kitchen sink, a man reading in a comfortable chair while a cat slept on his lap. These are the normal moments that made up most people's lives, the peaceful interludes between crises and celebrations. Sarah had spent so many years focused on the dramatic moments, the life and death decisions, the medical emergencies, that she had almost forgotten these quiet scenes existed. She returned to her apartment around 10 o'clock, feeling oddly tired despite having done nothing particularly strenuous all day. Mental adjustment, she realized, was its own kind of exhaustion. She took a hot bath, something she rarely had time for during her working years, and went to bed early with a book. Sarah fell asleep easily for the first time in months, without the anxiety of upcoming shifts or the mental replay of difficult cases. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, her body finally able to relax completely. At 2:47 a.m., her phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, jarring and insistent. Sarah's first instinct was panic. Late-night phone calls were never good news. Had something happened to one of her patients? Was there a family emergency? She fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, squinting at the screen in the darkness. The number was unfamiliar, not a hospital extension or any contact she recognized. For a moment, she considered not answering. She was no longer on call. She no longer had professional responsibilities that required her to be available at all hours. But 12 years of conditioning won out. She answered on the fifth ring. Sarah Martinez? The voice was male, authoritative, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Yes, this is Sarah. Who is this? Ma'am, my name is Commander Jake Sullivan with Naval Special Warfare. I apologize for calling at this hour, but we have a situation that requires your specific expertise. Sarah sat up in bed, instantly alert. Naval Special Warfare. That meant SEALs. I think you have the wrong person, Commander. I'm a cardiac nurse, and I just left my position at Walter Reed yesterday. Ma'am, you're exactly the right person. We know about your background, your experience with combat trauma, and cardiac surgery. We need your help. My help with what? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, I need to ask if you're on a secure line, and if you're alone. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. I'm alone, but this is just my cell phone. Commander Sullivan, what exactly is going on? Ma'am, we have a team in the field that's run into serious medical complications. Our corpsman is down, and we have multiple casualties that need immediate cardiac intervention. We can't extract them through normal medical channels due to the classified nature of the operation. Where are they? Another pause. I can't give you specifics over an unsecured line, but they're approximately 3,000 miles from your current location. The mission went sideways 6 hours ago, and our window for successful intervention is closing rapidly. Sarah's mind raced. She was no longer a military hospital nurse. She had no official capacity to help with classified operations. Commander, I don't understand why you're calling me. Surely there are other medical personnel who could assist. Ma'am, these men specifically requested you. What? How do they even know who I am? Ma'am, the team leader is Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson. He says you saved his life 2 years ago at Walter Reed after his helicopter went down in Syria. He remembers you telling him that recovery was a team effort and that you'd always have his six. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She remembered Marcus Thompson clearly. He had been one of her most challenging cases, a Special Forces operative who had suffered massive cardiac trauma during a mission that officially never happened. He had coded twice during his first week at Walter Reed, and Sarah had spent countless hours at his bedside, monitoring his condition and encouraging him to fight. Marcus had been angry when he first arrived, frustrated by his weakness and terrified that his military career was over. Sarah had worked with him not just on his physical recovery, but on accepting his new limitations and finding strength in different ways. When he was finally discharged, he had hugged her and said that she was the reason he was still alive. Marcus is requesting my help specifically? Yes, ma'am. The situation is critical. We have a C-130 standing by that can have you to their location in 6 hours. We need someone with your experience in combat cardiac trauma, and we need someone the team trusts. These men are in a hostile environment with limited resources, and their medical needs are beyond what our remaining personnel can handle. Sarah stood up and began pacing her small bedroom. Commander, I'm not military personnel. I don't have clearance for classified operations. I can't just fly to some undisclosed location and provide medical care. Ma'am, that's been arranged. You would be operating under emergency medical protocols with full authorization from the highest levels. Your security clearance has been temporarily reactivated, and you would be fully protected under military law. You're talking about flying to some foreign country in the middle of the night to perform surgery under combat conditions. This is insane. Yes, ma'am, it is insane. But these are good men, and they're running out of time. Sergeant Thompson said you once told him that a nurse's duty doesn't end with a shift change. He said you'd understand what that means. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the conversation Marcus was referencing. It had been during one of his darkest moments, when infection had set in and his recovery had taken a serious setback. He had been ready to give up, convinced that his body was too damaged to heal. Sarah had sat with him through the night, explaining that healing was a process that didn't follow hospital schedules or shift changes. She had told him that her commitment to his recovery didn't end when she clocked out. How many casualties are we talking about? 3 men with serious cardiac complications from an explosion. The corpsman did what he could, but they need surgical intervention that can only be provided by someone with your level of expertise. And the location is hostile? Yes, ma'am. You would be operating in an active combat zone with limited resources and potential enemy contact. Sarah sat back down on her bed, her mind spinning. 24 hours ago, she had been a civilian for the first time in 12 years. She had been looking forward to a peaceful break from the intensity of trauma medicine. She had been planning to sleep in, read books, maybe learn to paint. Now she was being asked to fly into a war zone to perform emergency surgery on Special Forces operatives using improvised equipment. It was dangerous, it was crazy, and it was exactly the kind of impossible situation that she had spent 12 years training for. Commander, can you give me Marcus Thompson's current status? Ma'am, he's conscious but weak. Shrapnel from an IED caused damage to his previous surgical site. He's stable for now, but that won't last long without intervention. And the other 2? One has a penetrating chest wound that's affecting cardiac function. The other has blast-related cardiac contusion with irregular rhythm. Ma'am, I won't lie to you. Without immediate surgical intervention, we're looking at least 2 fatalities, possibly all 3. Sarah thought about Marcus Thompson, remembering his determination to return to active duty despite his injuries. She thought about all the soldiers she had helped recover at Walter Reed, many of whom had returned to dangerous missions because they believed in their duty to their teammates. These men had specifically asked for her. They were trusting her with their lives, just as so many patients had over the years. The only difference was the location and the circumstances. What kind of medical equipment would be available? Improvised surgical suite with basic cardiac monitoring. We have emergency surgical supplies, but nothing like what you're used to at Walter Reed. You'd be working with military field equipment in less than ideal conditions. And extraction? Mission completion is expected within 12 hours. Medical evacuation would be immediate following successful treatment. Sarah looked around her quiet apartment, at the books on her nightstand, and the coffee cup from her leisurely afternoon at the cafe. 12 hours ago, this had represented freedom and peace. Now it felt like a different world entirely. Mom. Commander Sullivan's voice brought her back to the present. I need an answer. The plane needs to leave within 30 minutes if we're going to make this work. Sarah thought about David Kim, Jessica Torres, Michael Roberts, and all the other warriors she had helped heal. She thought about Marcus Thompson fighting for his life in some undisclosed location, asking for her specifically because he trusted her to save him again. She thought about what she had told Kevin Martinez, her replacement, about never stopping caring about the people in your care. She had left Walter Reed, but she had never stopped being a nurse. Her duty to help heal didn't end with her shift change or her career change. Commander Sullivan? Yes, ma'am. I'll need surgical scrubs and equipment specifications. And I want a direct communication line with Marcus Thompson before I get on that plane. Ma'am, does that mean you're accepting the assignment? Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Yes, Commander. I'm accepting the assignment. Give me 15 minutes to pack. As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that her retirement from the intensity of trauma medicine had lasted exactly 18 hours. But as she rushed around her apartment, gathering clothes and personal items, she felt more alive than she had since walking out of Walter Reed. Some people were called to quiet lives of contemplation and peace. Apparently, she was called to run toward the chaos, to bring healing to impossible situations, to answer the call when warriors needed her most. Her phone buzzed with a text message containing an address and instructions. A car would pick her up in 20 minutes. She would be briefed during the flight. Everything else was classified until further notice. Sarah grabbed her medical bag, the one she had carried through 12 years at Walter Reed. She had packed out of habit when leaving the hospital, not knowing she would need it again so soon. As she checked to make sure her personal medical instruments were included, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But it didn't feel heavy this time. It felt like coming home. The black sedan that pulled up to Sarah's apartment building at 3:15 a.m. looked like something from a movie. The driver was a young man in military dress who introduced himself simply as Corporal Davis and said nothing else during the 20-minute ride to Andrews Air Force Base. Sarah sat in the back seat, her medical bag clutched in her lap, watching the empty streets of Washington, D.C. flash by in the darkness. The reality of what she had agreed to was beginning to sink in. Less than an hour ago, she had been sleeping peacefully in her own bed as a civilian. Now she was heading to a classified military aircraft that would carry her to an undisclosed combat zone to perform emergency surgery under conditions she couldn't even imagine. The phone call with Commander Sullivan had been brief and efficient. He had given her only the essential information: 3 critically injured Special Forces operatives, cardiac complications from an IED explosion, improvised surgical conditions in a hostile environment. Everything else would be explained during the flight. What he hadn't told her, what she was only beginning to process, was how dramatically her life had just changed direction. Yesterday morning, she had been planning a quiet retirement from trauma medicine. Tonight, she was heading into what might be the most challenging medical situation of her career. Andrews Air Force Base at night was a maze of security checkpoints and restricted areas. Corporal Davis navigated them with practiced efficiency, showing credentials and receiving clearances that allowed their vehicle to proceed deeper into the installation. Sarah had been to Andrews before, accompanying patients on medical transports, but she had never seen this side of the operation. They pulled up beside a large aircraft that Sarah didn't recognize. It was painted in military gray with no visible markings or identifying numbers. Several people in flight suits were loading equipment onto the plane, their movements quick and purposeful in the floodlit darkness. "Ma'am, they're waiting for you aboard," Corporal Davis said, opening her door. Sarah stepped out into the cool night air, feeling completely out of place in her civilian clothes and carrying only her medical bag and a small overnight case. A woman in a flight suit approached her immediately. "Ms. Martinez? I'm Major Lisa Chun, flight surgeon. Welcome aboard." Major Chun led Sarah up the aircraft's ramp into what looked like a mobile medical facility. The interior had been configured with communications equipment, medical supplies, and a small area with seating for passengers. It was clearly designed for exactly this type of emergency medical deployment. "First time on a classified medical transport?" Major Chun asked as she showed Sarah to a seat and helped her secure her belongings. First time on any kind of military mission as a civilian, Sarah replied. This is all happening very fast. I know it seems overwhelming, but you're exactly what this situation requires. I've reviewed your files from Walter Reed. Your experience with combat cardiac trauma is exceptional. Major Chen handed Sarah a tablet computer. This contains all available intelligence about the current situation, medical profiles of the casualties, and equipment specifications for the improvised surgical facility you'll be working with. The flight is 6 hours, which should give you time to prepare. Sarah powered on the tablet and was immediately prompted for biometric verification. After scanning her fingerprint and retina, the device unlocked to reveal a series of classified documents and medical files. The first file contained photographs and basic information about the 3 injured operatives. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson was listed as 29 years old, previous cardiac surgical history documented, current condition stable but deteriorating. Sergeant First Class Ryan Mitchell, 26, penetrating chest wound with cardiac involvement, condition critical. Petty Officer Second Class David Park, 24, blast-related cardiac trauma, irregular rhythm, stable, but requiring immediate intervention. Sarah studied their faces, memorizing their features and medical histories. These weren't just cases or problems to be solved. They were young men with families and futures hanging in the balance. Marcus Thompson she knew personally, which added an extra layer of emotional investment to an already intense situation. The aircraft began to taxi as Sarah reviewed the mission intelligence. The team had been conducting a classified operation in an undisclosed location when they encountered an unexpected IED. The explosion had killed 1 team member instantly and critically injured 3 others. The surviving team members had secured a defensive position but were unable to evacuate the wounded through normal channels due to enemy activity in the area. The improvised medical facility would be located in a partially destroyed building that had been secured by the remaining team members. Power would be provided by portable generators. Surgical equipment would be limited to what could be transported in an emergency medical kit designed for special operations use. In other words, Sarah would be performing cardiac surgery using equipment that would have been considered primitive by World War II standards, in a location where enemy snipers might be watching through the windows. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Major Chun returned with additional briefing materials. The communication system will allow you to consult with cardiac surgeons at Walter Reed if needed, she explained. But realistically, once you're on the ground, you'll be making most decisions independently. The team has been instructed to provide whatever assistance you need, but their primary responsibility is security. How many people are we talking about? 12 Special Forces operatives, including the 3 casualties. The team leader is Captain Rodriguez, 15 years of experience in this type of operation. He's been briefed on your role and authority. Sarah continued reading, absorbing details about the tactical situation, available resources, and emergency extraction protocols. The more she learned, the more complex the mission became. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a classified military operation in hostile territory with international implications she couldn't fully understand. 2 hours into the flight, her satellite phone rang. The caller identification showed only a number she didn't recognize. This is Sarah Martinez. Ma'am, this is Marcus Thompson. Hearing his voice transported Sarah immediately back to Walter Reed, to the nights she had spent monitoring his recovery and encouraging him to keep fighting. He sounded weak, but alert, exactly the way he had sounded during his darkest moments of the hospital. Marcus, how are you holding up? Been better, ma'am. But I've been worse too, and you got me through that. Tell me about your current condition. Shrapnel opened up the surgical site from my previous operation. Bleeding is controlled for now, but I can feel the pressure building. Doc Martinez, I know this isn't exactly what you signed up for when you left Walter Reed. Sarah smiled despite the circumstances. Marcus, you know better than anyone that this job doesn't follow normal schedules. How are Mitchell and Park? Mitchell took shrapnel to the chest. He's conscious, but struggling. Park got thrown against a wall by the blast, and his heart rhythm has been irregular ever since. They both need help that's beyond what our corpsman could provide before he got hit. And the tactical situation? We're secure for now, but this isn't exactly a stable neighborhood. Captain Rodriguez has the area locked down, but we can't stay here indefinitely. Sarah looked out the aircraft window at the clouds illuminated by moonlight. Somewhere below, probably on a different continent, 12 American servicemen were defending a position while 3 of their teammates slowly died from injuries she might be able to treat. Marcus, I need you to do something for me. Anything, ma'am. I need you to stay strong for about 4 more hours. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. We'll all be here when you arrive. Good. And Marcus, I need you to trust me when I get there, even if what I have to do seems extreme given the circumstances. Ma'am, you could tell me you needed to operate with a butter knife, and I trust you. You saved my life once. I'm counting on you to do it again. The call ended, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the steady hum of the aircraft engines. She returned to the medical files, studying surgical techniques that could be adapted for the primitive conditions she would be facing. Major Chin approached with a meal that looked like it had been designed for astronauts. You should try to eat something, she advised. Once you're on the ground, food might not be a priority for a while. Sarah ate mechanically while continuing her preparation. She reviewed cardiac surgical procedures that could be performed with minimal equipment, memorized the layout of the improvised medical facility, and studied intelligence reports about potential enemy activity in the area. The remaining team members had impressive backgrounds. Captain Rodriguez was a Green Beret with multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. The surviving specialists included a communications expert, an explosives technician, a sniper, and several infantry operators with extensive combat experience. These were men who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions their respective services had to offer. They had trained for years to operate in exactly these kinds of impossible situations. Now, they were depending on her to save their teammates using skills she had learned in the controlled environment of a modern hospital. 3 hours into the flight, Sarah received another briefing from the mission commander. The tactical situation had deteriorated slightly, with increased enemy activity reported in the surrounding area. The extraction timeline had been moved up by 2 hours, giving her less time to complete the medical procedures. Is the mission still viable? Sarah asked. Affirmative. The team can maintain security for the reduced timeline, but you'll need to work efficiently. Efficiently? Sarah almost laughed at the understatement. She would be performing 3 complex cardiac procedures using improvised equipment in a combat zone, while under time pressure from both medical and tactical considerations. She spent the remaining flight time practicing procedures in her mind, visualizing each step of the operation she would need to perform. She reviewed anatomy diagrams and surgical techniques on the tablet, preparing for every contingency she could imagine. As the aircraft began its descent, Major Chun provided her with final equipment checks and communications protocols. Once you're on the ground, your call sign will be Doc. The team will provide security and assist with medical procedures as needed. Captain Rodriguez has final authority over tactical decisions, but medical decisions are entirely yours. Sarah changed into surgical scrubs and military-style boots that had been provided for the mission. Looking in the small aircraft mirror, she hardly recognized herself. 24 hours ago, she had been a retired nurse planning a quiet civilian life. Now she looked like she was heading into a war zone, which was exactly what she was doing. The aircraft landed with a thud that suggested they were on a rough airfield rather than a standard runway. Sarah could hear vehicles approaching outside and voices calling in languages she didn't recognize. Remember, Major Chun said as they prepared to disembark, you're not just treating patients. You're part of a mission that could have significant strategic implications. These men were conducting an operation that matters to national security. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. It wasn't just about saving lives, though that was obviously the priority. It was about ensuring that whatever mission these men had been conducting could be completed successfully. The aircraft door opened, revealing a landscape that looked like something from a post-apocalyptic movie. The airfield was little more than a cleared section of rocky ground, surrounded by mountains and partially destroyed buildings. The air was thick with dust and the smell of smoke from distant fires. A man in military fatigues approached immediately, his face covered with camouflage paint and dust. "Doc Martinez? I'm Captain Rodriguez. We've got a vehicle standing by to take you to the medical site." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and followed Captain Rodriguez to an armored vehicle that looked like it had seen better years. The driver and passenger were both armed and alert, constantly scanning their surroundings for threats. "How long to the site?" Sarah asked as they began driving through terrain that barely qualified as roads. 15 minutes if we don't run into trouble," Captain Rodriguez replied. "The building we're using is partially destroyed, but it's defensible and has enough space for your medical setup." Sarah could hear radio chatter between the team members, updates on enemy positions, and security perimeters. She was entering a world where every decision could be a matter of life and death, not just for her patients, but for everyone involved in the operation. "Captain, I need to understand something. What exactly was the mission that led to these injuries?" Rodriguez looked at her carefully. "Ma'am, that's classified above your clearance level. What I can tell you is that these men were attempting to secure intelligence that could prevent a significant terrorist attack. The operation was successful, but the cost was higher than expected. So the wounded men weren't just victims of random violence. They had been injured while attempting to prevent something worse from happening to other people. Their sacrifice had meaning beyond their own lives, which somehow made Sarah's responsibility feel even more important. The vehicle stopped beside a building that looked like it had been hit by artillery. Half the roof was missing, and several walls had large holes blown through them. But Sarah could see that the remaining structure was solid, and portable generators were already running to provide power. "Doc, welcome to your operating room," Captain Rodriguez said with dark humor. "It's not Walter Reed, but it'll have to do." Sarah stepped out of the vehicle and immediately heard someone calling her name. "Doc Martinez, over here." It was Marcus Thompson, and seeing him brought back a flood of memories from his recovery at Walter Reed. He was lying on a makeshift stretcher, pale and obviously in pain, but his eyes were alert and determined. Sarah knelt beside him, automatically checking his pulse and examining the surgical site that had been reopened by shrapnel. "Marcus, you look terrible," she said with a smile. "You should see the other guys," he replied weakly. "Doc, I can't tell you how good it is to see you." "Save your strength," Sarah said, standing up to survey the improvised medical facility. "We've got work to do." Captain Rodriguez showed her the medical equipment that had been set up inside the partially destroyed building. It was more comprehensive than she had expected, but still primitive compared to a modern operating room. Everything was functional but basic: monitoring equipment, surgical instruments, anesthesia supplies, and emergency medications. "This is what we have to work with," Rodriguez explained. "The communication system will allow you to consult with medical personnel at Walter Reed if needed, but response time will be several minutes due to satellite relay." Sarah examined the setup carefully, making mental notes about equipment limitations and procedural modifications she would need to make. She could work with this, but it would require adapting techniques she had learned from modern hospital conditions. "How much time do we have?" "Medical operations need to be completed within 4 hours to meet extraction timeline," Rodriguez replied. "After that, tactical situation becomes untenable. For hours to perform 3 cardiac procedures under combat conditions using improvised equipment." Sarah had faced challenging situations at Walter Reed, but nothing that combined medical complexity with tactical urgency and physical danger. She looked around at the team members who were preparing the security perimeter and assisting with medical setup. These were professionals who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions their country had to offer. They were trusting her to save their teammates so they could complete their mission and get everyone home safely. Sarah checked her watch and began mentally organizing the procedures she would need to perform. Marcus Thompson first, since she knew his case best, and He was the most stable. Then, Ryan Mitchell, whose penetrating chest wound required immediate attention. Finally, David Park, whose cardiac rhythm problems were serious but not immediately life-threatening. "All right, everyone," she announced to the team. "We're going to save these men and get them home. Let's get started." The improvised operating room looked like something from a medical disaster movie, but Sarah had learned long ago that healing could happen anywhere if you had the right attitude and competent hands. The partially destroyed building provided enough shelter and space for 3 surgical stations, while portable generators hummed outside, providing the power that would keep her patients alive. "First priority is Marcus Thompson," Sarah announced to the team as she scrubbed her hands with antiseptic solution from a portable dispenser. "Captain Rodriguez, I need 2 of your men to assist with each procedure. They don't need medical training, just steady hands and the ability to follow instructions." Rodriguez nodded and assigned team members to medical duties. Sarah could see the concern in their faces as they looked at their wounded teammates, but she also saw the disciplined focus that had gotten them this far. Marcus was already on the surgical table, a makeshift affair constructed from equipment cases and medical padding. The wound where shrapnel had reopened his previous surgical site was ugly, but manageable. Sarah had dealt with similar complications at Walter Reed, though never under these conditions. "Marcus, I'm going to give you local anesthesia to supplement the pain medication," she explained as she prepared the injection. "I need you conscious so that you can tell me how you're feeling during the procedure." "Whatever you need to do, Doc," Marcus replied weakly. "Just get me back on my feet so I can help with Mitchell and Park." Sarah smiled despite the circumstances. Even wounded and facing surgery under combat conditions, Marcus was thinking about his teammates. It was exactly the attitude she remembered from his recovery at Walter Reed. The surgical procedure began with Sarah carefully reopening the wound to assess the internal damage. The shrapnel had torn through scar tissue from the previous operation, causing significant bleeding and threatening the structural integrity of the cardiac repair. "Sergeant Williams," Sarah called to one of her assistants, "I need you to hold this retractor steady while I locate the source of the bleeding." Sergeant Williams was a communications specialist with no medical training, but he followed Sarah's instructions with the same precision he applied to his technical duties. Within minutes, she had identified the damaged blood vessels and begun the delicate process of repairing them. Working with improvised lighting and basic instruments, Sarah found herself relying on experience and intuition more than technology. Every decision had to be made quickly and confidently, with no room for hesitation or second-guessing. "How are you feeling, Marcus?" she asked as she worked to control the bleeding. "Like I got hit by a truck, but better than I was an hour ago," he replied. "Doc, the pressure in my chest is easing up." "Good. The bleeding is under control, and I'm reinforcing the previous surgical repairs. You're going to be fine." 20 minutes into the procedure, Sarah heard gunfire in the distance. Captain Rodriguez immediately moved to the communication station, coordinating with team members who were maintaining the security perimeter. "Doc, we've got enemy contact about 2 clicks out," Rodriguez reported. "Sniper fire, but they haven't located our position yet." "How much longer do you need?" 15 minutes for Marcus. Then I start on Mitchell," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "Can you maintain security for another 3 hours?" "Affirmative. But we may need to be ready to move quickly if they get too close." Sarah continued working, her hands steady despite the knowledge that hostile forces were actively hunting for their position. This was the kind of pressure she had never experienced at Walter Reed, where the only urgency came from medical conditions rather than enemy action. "Okay, Marcus, I'm closing now," she announced as she began suturing the surgical site. "The repair is solid, and bleeding is completely controlled. You're going to have a scar, but your heart function should be back to normal." "Thanks, Doc," Marcus said as team members moved him to a recovery area and prepared the surgical station for the next patient. "I'll owe you twice now." "You don't owe me anything," Sarah replied as she began preparing for Ryan Mitchell's surgery. "Just focus on healing so you can get home to your family." Mitchell's case was more complex than Marcus's. The shrapnel had penetrated his chest cavity and caused damage to both his heart and surrounding tissue. Sarah would need to perform a more extensive procedure to remove foreign objects and repair multiple sites of injury. "Ryan, can you hear me?" Sarah asked as team members positioned him on the surgical table. "Yes, ma'am," Mitchell replied weakly. "Heard you fixed up Thompson. Ready to get the same treatment." "This one's going to be more complicated," Sarah explained as she examined his wounds. "The shrapnel is still in your chest, and I need to remove it without causing additional damage to your heart." Sarah began the procedure by carefully opening Mitchell's chest cavity to assess the extent of his injuries. The shrapnel had caused significant trauma, but she could see that the damage was reparable if she worked carefully and systematically. "Corporal Johnson, I need you to monitor his pulse while I work around his heart," she instructed one of her assistants. "Tell me immediately if you notice any changes." The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and Sarah could hear Rodriguez coordinating defensive positions over the radio. The enemy had apparently detected their general location and was conducting a systematic search of the area. "Doc, we've got maybe 90 minutes before we need to be ready for immediate extraction," Rodriguez warned. "Understood," Sarah replied, focusing on the delicate work of removing shrapnel from Mitchell's heart without causing additional bleeding. "Ryan, how's your pain level?" "Manageable," Mitchell replied through gritted teeth. "Just get this metal out of me." Working with basic surgical instruments, Sarah carefully extracted 3 pieces of shrapnel from Mitchell's chest cavity. Each removal required precise movements to avoid damaging blood vessels or cardiac tissue. She found herself wishing for the advanced imaging equipment available at Walter Reed, but years of experience had taught her to work with whatever tools were available. "That's the last piece," she announced as she removed a jagged fragment of metal from near Mitchell's heart. "Now I need to repair the damage and make sure there's no internal bleeding." The repair work was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring Sarah to suture multiple sites while monitoring Mitchell's cardiac function with the basic monitoring equipment available. She could hear the gunfire getting closer, but she forced herself to maintain focus on the medical procedures. "His pulse is strengthening," Corporal Johnson reported. "Whatever you just did seems to be working." "Good. The bleeding is controlled, and I've repaired all the visible damage. Ryan, you're going to be weak for a while, but your heart function should return to normal within a few weeks." "Thank you, ma'am," Mitchell whispered as team members prepared to move him to the recovery area. "I never thought I'd be grateful to see a nurse in a combat zone." "Nurses go where they're needed," Sarah replied as she prepared for the final surgery. "That's part of the job description." David Park's case was different from the first two. Instead of visible trauma requiring surgical repair, he was suffering from cardiac arrhythmia caused by the blast effects of the explosion. His heart rhythm was dangerously irregular, requiring electrical intervention to restore normal function. "David, I'm going to use the defibrillator to reset your heart rhythm," Sarah explained as team members connected monitoring equipment. "It's going to be uncomfortable, but it should solve the problem immediately." "Do whatever you need to do," Park replied, his voice strained from the effort of speaking with an irregular heartbeat. "I just want to get back to normal." Sarah carefully positioned the defibrillator paddles and checked the electrical settings on the improvised equipment. This was always a critical moment in cardiac care, requiring precise timing and correct electrical dosage. "Everyone clear," she announced, checking to make sure no one was in contact with Park or the surgical table. "Charging. Clear." The electrical shock caused Park's entire body to jerk, but the monitor immediately showed improvement in his cardiac rhythm. Sarah watched the readings carefully, looking for signs of continued irregularity. "Better, but not perfect," she observed. "I'm going to give you medication to stabilize the rhythm, then do one more electrical cardioversion." As Sarah prepared the medications, the gunfire outside suddenly intensified. Rodriguez's voice came over the communication system with obvious urgency. "Doc, enemy forces have located our position. We got maybe 30 minutes before we need to extract. How much longer do you need?" 20 minutes, Sarah replied, injecting cardiac medication into Park's foreline. "David, I need you to stay calm while this medication takes effect. The sound of explosions joined the gunfire, indicating that the enemy was using grenades or mortars in their assault on the defensive perimeter. Sarah could feel the building shake from nearby impacts, but she forced herself to concentrate on the cardiac monitoring equipment. Rhythm is stabilizing, she observed with satisfaction. David, how do you feel? Much better, Park replied, his voice stronger and more steady. My chest doesn't feel like it's fluttering anymore. One more electrical treatment to make sure the rhythm stays stable, Sarah announced. This should be the last one. She administered the second cardioversion, and the monitor showed immediate improvement to a normal cardiac rhythm. Park's vital signs stabilized quickly, indicating that the treatment had been successful. That's it, Sarah announced. All 3 patients are stable and ready for transport. Rodriguez appeared at her side immediately. Outstanding work, document. We need to move now. Enemy forces are within 500 meters and closing. Sarah quickly gathered her essential medical equipment while team members prepared the patients for transport. The wounded men were loaded onto stretchers that could be carried by their teammates, with medical monitoring equipment adapted for movement. Marcus, how do you feel? Sarah asked as the team prepared to leave the improvised medical facility. Like I could take on the world, Marcus replied with a weak smile. Thanks for saving my life again. Ryan, Mitchell, how's you breathing? Sarah checked with the second patient. Good to go, ma'am, Mitchell replied. Ready to get out of this place. David, any chest discomfort? Sarah asked the third patient. Negative, Park replied. Heart feels normal for the first time since the explosion. Captain Rodriguez led the team out of the partially destroyed building and toward a landing zone where extraction helicopters were standing by. The sound of enemy fire was close enough that Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the distance, but the defensive perimeter was holding. As they moved through the rocky terrain toward the landing zone, Sarah realized that she had just completed the most challenging medical procedures of her career. She had performed 3 cardiac surgeries using improvised equipment under combat conditions, with enemy forces actively trying to kill everyone involved. More importantly, she had saved 3 lives and enabled a classified mission to be completed successfully. Whatever intelligence these men had secured during their operation would now make it back to American forces, potentially preventing the terrorist attack that Rodriguez had mentioned. The extraction helicopters appeared over the horizon just as the team reached the landing zone. Sarah could hear the enemy forces getting closer, but she also knew that in a few minutes they would all be safely airborne and heading home. Doc, Marcus called out over the sound of approaching helicopters. I told you that recovery was a team effort. This time you were definitely part of the team. Sarah smiled as she helped load the wounded men onto the helicopters. She had spent 12 years healing warriors at Walter Reed, but she had never been closer to the battle than she was at this moment. As the helicopters lifted off and carried them away from the combat zone, Sarah looked down at the partially destroyed building where she had just performed 3 life-saving surgeries. It looked insignificant from the air, just another damaged structure in a landscape scarred by conflict. But for her, it would always represent the place where she discovered that healing could happen anywhere, under any conditions, if you had the courage to try and the skill to succeed. The mission was complete, the patients were stable, and everyone was going home. Sometimes, Sarah thought, as she watched the mountains pass below, that was all you could ask for. The helicopter ride back to the staging area passed in a blur of medical monitoring and quiet conversation. Sarah spent the flight checking on her 3 patients, ensuring that their vital signs remained stable and that the surgical repairs were holding up under the stress of transport. Marcus Thompson was alert and talkative, already planning his return to active duty despite having undergone emergency surgery less than 3 hours earlier. Ryan Mitchell was weak but stable, his breathing easier now that the shrapnel had been removed from his chest. David Park's heart rhythm remained steady and strong, showing no signs of the dangerous irregularity that had threatened his life. Doc, Captain Rodriguez said over the helicopter's intercom system, I've received word that you'll be debriefed at the staging area before your return flight to Washington. The mission commanders want to thank you personally. Sarah nodded, though she felt strange about receiving thanks for doing what seemed like the obvious thing to do. These men had been injured while serving their country, and she had simply provided the medical care they needed. It seemed like a natural extension of the work she had been doing at Walter Reed for 12 years. The staging area turned out to be a forward operating base that looked like a small city constructed from prefabricated buildings and military equipment. Sarah could see aircraft of various types, communication arrays, and the kind of organized activity that indicated this was a major hub for classified operations. Her 3 patients were immediately transferred to a field hospital for additional observation and preparation for medical evacuation back to the United States. Sarah accompanied them, wanting to ensure that the transition of care was handled properly and that the receiving medical personnel understood the procedures she had performed. Dr. Williams? Sarah was approached by a woman in military fatigues with major's insignia. I'm Major Patricia Collins, Chief Medical Officer for this installation. I understand you performed some remarkable surgery under extremely difficult conditions. I did what needed to be done, Sarah replied. The patients are stable, but they'll need follow-up care when they return to Walter Reed. Major Collins reviewed the medical records Sarah had compiled during and after the surgical procedures. Her expression showed professional admiration as she read about the technique Sarah had used to adapt standard cardiac surgery for the primitive conditions in the field. This is exceptional work, Major Collins said. I've been practicing military medicine for 15 years, and I've never seen better improvised cardiac surgery. These men owe you their lives. Sarah was escorted to a debriefing room where several officers were waiting for her. At the head of the table sat a man with colonel's insignia who introduced himself as Colonel James Mitchell, the overall mission commander. Ms. Martinez, Colonel Mitchell began, I want to personally thank you for your service today. The operation these men were conducting was critical to national security, and your intervention ensured that they could complete their mission and return home safely. Can you tell me what the mission accomplished? Sarah asked. Colonel Mitchell exchanged glances with the other officers before responding. I can tell you that the intelligence they secured will prevent a terrorist attack that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. Their sacrifice and your intervention may have saved more lives than we'll ever know. Sarah felt a wave of emotion as she realized the full scope of what had happened. Marcus, Ryan, and David hadn't just been random casualties of war. They had been injured while actively working to protect other people, and her medical intervention had enabled them to complete that mission. Ms. Martinez, Colonel Mitchell continued, I've been authorized to offer you a position as a civilian medical contractor for Special Operations Command. Your performance today demonstrates exactly the kind of expertise we need for future missions of this type. Sarah was stunned. You're offering me a job? A very special kind of job, Colonel Mitchell replied. You would be on call for medical emergencies involving special forces operations worldwide. The work would be classified, dangerous, and absolutely critical to national security. Sarah thought about the past 24 hours. She had gone from retired civilian to combat surgeon in the span of a single phone call. She had performed life-saving surgery under conditions she had never imagined, and she had been part of a mission that would save innocent lives. I need some time to think about it, she said. Of course, but I hope you'll seriously consider it. There are very few medical professionals with your combination of skills and courage. Sarah was escorted to quarters where she could rest before her flight back to Washington. As she lay on the narrow military cot, she reflected on everything that had happened since her phone rang at 2:47 a.m. 2 days ago, she had been planning a quiet retirement filled with books and coffee shops and sleeping late. Now she was being offered a position that would take her to dangerous places around the world, providing medical care for America's most elite warriors under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The flight back to Washington gave Sarah more time to process the experience. She sat next to Major Chun, the flight surgeon who had briefed her on the outbound journey, and they talked about the medical challenges she had faced. You know, Major Chun said, Most military medical personnel train their entire careers for the kind of situation you handle today. You walked into a combat zone and performed flawlessly with no military training and no preparation for the tactical environment. I had good people helping me, Sarah replied. Captain Rodriguez and his team made it possible for me to focus on the medical work. That's true, but you were the one making the life or death decisions. You were the one adapting surgical techniques for improvised conditions. You saved 3 lives under circumstances that would have challenged the most experienced military surgeons. Sarah looked out the aircraft window at the landscape passing below. Somewhere down there, people were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that a terrorist attack had been prevented by the actions of a small special forces team and an improvised cardiac surgery in a partially destroyed building. Major Chun, can I ask you something? Of course. How do you handle the emotional weight of this kind of work? Knowing that people's lives depend on your decisions, that mistakes can have catastrophic consequences. Major Chun was quiet for a moment before responding. You learn to trust your training and your instincts. You accept that you can't save everyone, but you never stop trying. And you remember that the work matters, even when it's difficult and dangerous. Do you ever regret choosing this path? Never. There are easier ways to practice medicine, but there aren't many ways to make as much difference in the world. When the aircraft landed at Andrews Air Force Base, Sarah felt like she was returning from a different universe. The familiar surroundings of Washington, D.C. seemed almost surreal after the intensity of the combat zone and the makeshift surgery she had performed. A car was waiting to take her home, but first she asked to be taken to Walter Reed Medical Center. She wanted to check on Marcus Thompson, Ryan Mitchell, and David Park, who had been transported directly to the hospital for continued care. The cardiac surgery unit at Walter Reed felt strange after her experience in the field. Everything was clean, well-lit, and equipped with the most advanced medical technology available. After performing surgery with improvised equipment under combat conditions, the hospital seemed almost luxuriously equipped. Sarah found Marcus Thompson in the intensive care unit, awake and alert despite having undergone surgery less than 12 hours earlier. His wife and 2 young children were at his bedside, and Sarah could see the relief in their faces as they realized he was going to be okay. "Doc Martinez," Marcus called out when he saw her. "I was hoping you'd stop by. How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, checking his chart and noting that his vital signs were excellent. "Like a new man. The doctors here say the surgery you performed was textbook perfect despite the circumstances." Marcus's wife stood up and hugged Sarah, tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Marcus told me what you did, how you came all the way to help him and his teammates." "I was just doing my job," Sarah replied, feeling uncomfortable with the praise. "No," Marcus's wife said firmly. "You saved my husband's life. You saved my children's father. What you did was way beyond any job." Sarah visited Ryan Mitchell and David Park, finding both of them recovering well from their surgeries. Their families were also present, and she received the same overwhelming gratitude from people who understood that their loved ones had come very close to dying in that foreign combat zone. As she finally drove home to her apartment, Sarah reflected on the contrast between her quiet civilian life and the intense world of special operations medicine. She had thought she was retiring from high-stakes medical practice, but instead she had discovered an entirely new level of challenge and responsibility. Her apartment felt empty and quiet after the intensity of the past 24 hours. She made coffee and sat by her window, watching normal life happen on the street below. People walked their dogs, went to work, ran errands, all of them unaware that their safety had been protected by the actions of a few warriors in a distant combat zone. Her phone rang at exactly noon. It was Colonel Mitchell. "Ms. Martinez, have you had a chance to consider our offer?" Sarah looked around her peaceful apartment, thinking about the book she had planned to read and the quiet life she had planned to live. Then, she thought about Marcus Thompson's children, who still had their father, because she had been willing to answer a phone call in the middle of the night. "Colonel Mitchell, I accept your offer." "Excellent. You'll receive complete briefings on your new role within the week. Welcome to Special Operations Command, Ms. Martinez. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her retirement from trauma medicine had lasted exactly 18 hours. But she also realized that she had found her true calling, the work she was meant to do with her skills and experience. Some people were called to quiet lives of contemplation and peace. Sarah Martinez was called to bring healing to the most dangerous places in the world, to answer the phone when warriors needed her most, to serve her country in ways she had never imagined. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Marcus Thompson, Ryan Mitchell, and David Park standing together in front of the American flag, all of them fully recovered and back on active duty. On the back of the photograph, Marcus had written, "Doc, thanks for reminding us that recovery is a team effort. You'll always have our six." Sarah placed the photograph on her mantle next to her nursing school graduation picture and her Employee of the Year award from Walter Reed. It represented the moment when she had discovered that her service to others wasn't ending with her departure from the hospital. It was just beginning in ways she had never expected. The next morning, her phone rang at 3:15 a.m. The caller ID showed only a number she didn't recognize, but Sarah answered immediately. Sarah Martinez. "Ma'am, this is Commander Jackson with Naval Special Warfare. We have a situation that requires your specific expertise." Sarah was already reaching for her medical bag before the commander finished explaining the mission. Somewhere in the world, warriors needed her help, and she was ready to answer the call. "Commander Jackson, give me the coordinates. I'm on my way." As she headed out into the night toward another aircraft that would take her to another impossible situation, Sarah realized that she had finally found her place in the world. She was no longer just a nurse or a medical professional. She was a guardian angel for America's most elite warriors, ready to bring healing to the darkest places on Earth. Her last nursing shift at Walter Reed had ended, but her true service had just begun.